Hello and welcome to the Indian Sun. My name is Sanjeev. Today we are going to talk about the topic disinvestment. This is one of the prominent topics to know, and these days we are seeing a lot of news in India regarding disinvestments. To give an example, recently Air India disinvestment had happened. This is not a new topic. Since 1980, a large number of disinvestment have occurred across various parts of the world. Post 1991, the number of disinvestments in India are increasing with time, which appears to be a positive trend. But to get more clarity and deeper insights on this topic, we have an eminent professor, Amol Agrawal, with us. To give a brief introduction about Professor Amol, he received his PhD in economics from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, which is one of the India's top business schools. He previously worked as an economist at Indicus Analytics, IDBI Guilds Limited, and Dhanlaxmi Bank. He is currently an economics assistant professor at Ahmedabad University. Thank you so much for accepting our invite and giving your time to our viewers.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Professor, to start with, can we have what basics about the disinvestment? What are disinvestment? Is it another form of investment? And what is the philosophy behind the disinvestment?
So disinvestment, as far as India is concerned, started with the 1991 reforms, where the Finance Minister Manmohan Singh announced that in order to increase efficiency in the public sector and also to raise revenues for the government, they will start disinvesting from certain public sector enterprises. Now, which means that you will start selling some stake in the government-owned enterprises. And just for the audience here, we need to just do a little bit rewind to 1947, when India got its independence. We are celebrating its the 75 years. So in 1947, the government took this step to modernize the economy and grow the economy, and the way to do this was public sector, in the sense that public sector will play a major role. By public sector, I mean basically the government will set up enterprises in critical sectors, especially steel, oil, gas, and heavy machinery, heavy industry. So essentially, and then gradually, it started with strategic sectors, and then gradually, a lot of industries in India were established in the public sector domain. So all these industries were in. It was initially to do with critical sectors, sectors which were important for India's development, and then gradually, even consumer sectors, even things which private sector could do, were basically were pushed into the public sector domain. So by 1991, we had most part of the Indian economy was served by the public sector, and there were concerns that a lot of funds of the budget were used for public sector and not for goods which are essentially should be served by the government in terms of education, healthcare, and so on. So in 1991, as we hit the balance of payments crisis, and it was not just the balance of payments crisis, many crises were leading to it. So that was seen as an opportunity by the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh and late Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, who reformed the economy, and one of their who took many steps to reform the economy. One of the steps was disinvestment, and the purpose was twofold. First is to raise revenues for the government, and second is to also bring some efficiency into the public sector by privatizing some of these entities, by bringing some private shareholder, and so that was the rationale behind disinvestment.
Got it. And what are the major disinvestments? Like, can we categorize into the strategic versus non-strategic disinvestments?
So there is non-strategic disinvestment would typically be all those disinvestments in which there is public sector, but private sector can pretty much perform the role. For instance, there is a lot of talk about privatizing or disinvesting the public sector banks. So which means that you know, apart from apart from creating public sector enterprises, we also nationalized a lot of private sector industries, and they also became part of public sector. One of those sectors was banking, and we've seen over the years that private sector is very efficient, whether it's ICICI or HDFC, and all these people, all these banks are very efficient in delivering banking services. So you can basically disinvest uh, banking banking sector and let private sector run it, because there is very little in terms of there is very little strategic things here, right? Likewise,
Yes.
Air India, as you mentioned, uh, we know that Indigo and all these private airlines are doing a much better job of managing the airline, and you really don't need an Air India to, which is run by the government, to manage to be run by the government. So all these, sectors which don't really mean anything for the country. I mean, they're not really putting the country at some sort of a disadvantage or something. And strategic disinvestment typically is in all these critical sectors, right? I mean, if you want to disinvest ONGC, or if you want to disinvest some of these NTPC, and these critical companies which are seen as very important for India, so those will be uh, strategic sort of disinvestment. But having said that, we've not really done very well in the non-strategic disinvestment. So I think there is a lot to be disinvested there before we even talk about strategic disinvestment.
Got it, Professor. And
Yeah,
can you give us the overview of the what type of assets should be disinvested versus not?
yeah. I mean, this is sort of connected to what your
Previous.
earlier question was about strategic and non-strategic. So
Yes.
obviously, if there is something which is going to question India's sovereignty, for instance, privatizing the atomic energy, or privatizing some of these army-related army-related the ordnances, and all these factories which are there. So some of them could be very critical, because you don't really want to share uh, uh, nation's strengths and secrets and all that with the private sector. Anything else,
Yes.
for instance, when it comes to like I said, banking, or when it comes to insurance, there is nothing strategic about it, in the sense that these banks or these insurance companies, if you sell it to a private player, it will not harm India's sovereignty or security interests. So anything which can be you know can be really sold off uh, without really compromising India's interests, India's sovereignty, that should be uh, that can be sold. So those are some of the assets which can be sold. So if I am running a cement plant, uh, or if I am running some kind of a another, let's say, toothpaste company
Hmm.
under the government sort of a thing, or if I am manufacturing air conditioners, uh, then all these things can be sold off, because the private sector can do these activities without uh, and perhaps do it more efficiently. Now, when I say this, there is obviously a right, and it's not as if private sector is always efficient. We see a lot of failures with private sector. Uh, Firms fail all the time. Banks have done
Hmm.
badly, but compared to the resources, compared to uh, what should the government be doing, uh, perhaps we've seen in the pandemic that India's healthcare, and even post-pandemic, the education and all these sort of public goods, as we understand, these are the goods which should be provided by the government. Uh, they are really lacking. So the government's attention should really be on those goods, rather than look at providing those goods and services which private sector can provide. So it is like that, right? So you have to do things which you are good at, and the government
Got it.
should be doing things which it is good at, and let the private sector do things which it is good at. So it's very difficult for the private sector, for instance, to though private sector is doing a lot for healthcare and for education, but when you're talking about making these things affordable, making these things reach out
Yes.
to a larger public and all that. State still has a role to play.
So till now we learned about the disinvestments in India. Now can you give us insights on overview of disinvestments happening across the globe?
That's a tough question. Essentially, disinvestment as a strategy was popularized by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. More so, Margaret Thatcher, because British economy was largely public sector economy, and Thatcher privatized a lot of industries and a lot of assets. And this is a time when this conflict between markets and state, the markets are seen as doing a better job compared to the state. Uh, so lots of leaders who are inspired by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they make these statements that the economy would largely be run by private sector and all that. There have been lots of experiments on privatizing, disinvesting. Uh, some have been successful, but some have been disastrous. Especially, in case of Russia, the disinvestment typically meant that the assets changed hands from the government to the crony capitalists of Russia. I'm forgetting what their name is, what they're called, but so you don't really want that, right? You don't want something to move from one state monopoly to another private monopoly. And when I'm talking about this, the Russian people really, the Russian government didn't ensure that the disinvestment is done in the right spirit. It's not just about selling something, but it is making sure that it is going to the right persons, the right people, and it will, those assets will not be then used for exploiting. Uh, so there are all these case studies across the world of disinvestments done well and disinvestments done badly. India is somewhere in the middle, as it always is. We've neither done very well nor we've done very badly. It could have. I mean, it's really a case of glass half full. Glass. Uh, glass which is either half full or half empty. You can argue from both sides. We've not done very badly, but we've not done very well because there is, as I argue, there are lots of public sector enterprises which could have been disinvested. And now, since private sector is performing much better in these industries, some of those assets will only be sold at a discount. So, that's a call every government has to make, that that we should remain in strategic sectors. We should remain in sectors which will not undermine the government and India's security, but everything else allow the private sector to perform, because private sector brings competition, they bring ideas. Yes, it fails, but that's how economy is. Economy is not just about protecting whatever is there. For a long time we didn't have any choice when it came to buying vehicles, buying toothpastes, buying anything. There, your generation would not even understand this, but my generation, which is sort of a cross generation between the pre 90s and the post 90s, there's a sea change. One didn't get chocolates. Even smallest of the things were not available. They were only and because the private sector was not allowed to venture into it, public sector was very inefficient. A modern bread, the bread used to be terrible compared to the kind of bread we get from some of these. And modern bread was sold to Hindustan Lever, and they tried to revive it, but they couldn't. So again, this is something which you have to do quickly, not really spend a lot of time. But that's where political economy comes in, where as a ruling party, can you convince the opposition? Can you convince your own party that these things have to be done quickly and we need to move on? So usually we look at the bad examples of disinvestments. but there are some good ones as well. So it always will be a mixed bag, but compared to keeping something which is bankrupt in the state, it is not doing too well in the public sector, it is better that you allow the markets and the private sector to decide whether it wants to run this or it wants to close it. But in public sector, you will keep running it, right? Because there is a social goal, there is an employment goal. You don't want to fire people, but then that's the nature of the industry, right? As Joseph Schumpeter said about creative destruction, is the essence of capitalism, is the essence of even human life. Everything is creative destruction. So whether one looks at Schumpeter or you look at Bhagavad Gita or whichever, the ideas are the same, right? In the sense that what you're saying is that new will come, which will replace the old, and that's how it is.
Got it, Prof. And just a follow-up question on this one: do the governments have any control once any property is given to the private for the disinvestment? Will they monitor how the progress is there?
No, so this depends on how much you have sold. So disinvestment, when I'm saying disinvestment, it's not as if it's 100% sold off to the private sector. So if you are selling 10% to the private sector and you have 90%, then obviously you will call the shots. The government will call the shots. So depending on how much you sell. So obviously, if you sell more than 50%, which means ownership is mainly with the private sector, then your say in the business will come down. And then there are these SEBI rules and regulations and even company law which specifies these things, that how much of if it's a public sector which is listed company, then SEBI rules will apply. If it's a non-listed company, then company affairs, the Indian Companies Act, and they have all these levels which specify. So I think you have to bring down the stake lower than 33% in order for you to not have a say in anything. So if the stake is sort of lower than 30%, then you don't really have much say in the. But then government is government, right? A government can pull up a private company. A government can pull up anyone. It can pull up you and me. So saying that, okay, this is because at the end the government has lots of power. So even if it's a private company, the government can interfere. So it's not as if the government sells something, it cannot say anything to that owner of the new owner of the old company, right? So again, this is based on how the government sees the whole thing, right? That whether you want markets and private sector to perform in the right spirit, or you are doing disinvestments and all these things just for namesake, that okay, the financial problems are yours, and all this issues of who is going to be on the board and who's going to do this, who's going to do that, I'm going to decide. That way, obviously private sector itself will not be interested to invest in that business.
True. Yeah, got it.
So all these things are decided upfront, and we have to decide. The private sector should decide whether it wants to get into this or not.
Got it.
Yeah.
And till now we have seen from the government side. Now moving towards the citizens, because of disinvestments, what are the advantages to the citizens?
No, obviously, first advantage is choices. You get hopefully better products. Now, I must repeat, I'm not saying private sector is always more efficient. There are lots of private sector failures. It is just that when there is competition, private sector will generally try and innovate and give you, give you products which will try and tell the customer that I have something different, right? So in that sense, you get more efficient choices. You get larger efficiency, and since the public sector, lot of government resources move from the public sector management to citizen management in terms of giving them all these things which the current government is doing, whether it's cooking gas or whether it is providing all these facilities, even building public parks and healthcare and all these missions the government has with uh, which are connected to education, healthcare, general well-being. The government can spend there, so citizens obviously benefit if government's energies are translated towards the welfare of citizens and not towards just welfare of public sector enterprises. So I think that way it's a win-win situation, because the government also gets revenues from selling these stakes. Government can focus on things which it is good at, and people can get choices from the private sector, and also uh, you know choices, and then you can if I mean you can always decide based on choices which products you want to consume and not consume. So that way, and that's how economics also functions, right? You need choices. Obviously, if
True.
there is just one ambassador and one Fiat car, and both are
Monopoly.
both are not that great, I have no choice. I mean, but today,
True.
I mean, any car has so many variants that you are just sort of spoiled for choices. Yes, it is adding to the confusion, but that's what markets are. It's not as if, and people are spending a lot of time in car showrooms trying to understand how to buy
Yeah.
a car. Likewise, toothbrushes, toothpastes. It's
Yeah.
humongous number of choices. You travel to any of these stores, big stores,
Yeah.
and you are surprised by the innovations and the choices, and the way private sector is trying to improvise about these things and making things. If you look at the entire fintech sector, if you look at the all this technology space, the number of ideas which are
Yes.
coming in, so many apps which are coming in, and this
Yes.
is largely possible because yes, the government creates that ecosystem and all that, but within that ecosystem, it's the private players which then get together and say that, okay, what can we do better? How do we compete? How do I provide this service so that I can make
Yes.
money? And so the whole thing, in my view, improves that way.
Got it. Finally, to conclude, like, what is the impact of disinvestment on stock markets?
uh, there are multiple ways, multiple answers to this. So firstly, uh, if if one typically sees Indian economy, right, and once there is disinvestment and these companies get listed, then it sets some sort of a benchmark. For instance, LIC. So for a long time, insurance industry, yes, there were some players which had listed, but uh, because of the fact that LIC was not listed, and LIC is this big daddy in the room. So if LIC is not listed and people don't know about anything about LIC, then the insurance sector will not get its true valuation. If I am
Hmm.
looking at investing in insurance, and the biggest player there, since there is no information, since it was a government company, it was not a listed company. So I think what is important here is disinvestment and listing. I mean, both have to be understood. It's not just about selling something to a private player or to somebody and that company is not listed. So once it's listed, then the insurance sector begins to be valued properly. Then you know that, because when you are listed, then when you disinvest and you list, then that information you have to release every week. Sorry, there is every quarter you are releasing financials of the firm. That is reflected in the valuation of the company. When the biggest player is valued, the smaller players will also be valued, right? So this is what happened in India. As the disinvestment started, we set up the National Stock Exchange, though there was a Bombay Stock Exchange, but Bombay Stock Exchange at that time was run by brokers. It was not a very professional place. The National Stock Exchange, much professional. So a lot of these companies, and there was this mandate that as we are disinvesting, we need to list also in some years.
Hmm.
So a lot of these banks, which were uh, uh, they were all asked to list, and gradually the stock markets get deeper. The trading starts in these markets. You have more number of scripts coming to these markets. There is better valuation. Citizens can invest in these companies. So in that sense, it also leads to choices, right? We are talking about choices. We're talking about the fact that more companies come in, they give us products. So likewise, we need more companies coming in these markets, giving us financial choices. So
Yes.
And then you will see parallelly, if you pick up public sector, an index tracking public sector companies, and an index tracking the private companies in the same sector. So for instance, public sector banks or private sector banks, or you track public sector enterprises in some other sector and private enterprise in some other sector. You will generally see that private sector is where people are, I mean, those are being valued much higher. So those all these things, after disinvesting and after listing, you understand that everyone can't be wrong, right? Investors, consumers, if everybody is preferring private sector, then obviously there is the public sector needs to either revitalize itself or needs to get more into disinvestments. So that way, this disinvestments has been very interesting for the stock markets, because, and I think this is a very interesting thing which India has done, that we have tried to disinvest through the stock markets. So which means that the company is not just shifting assets from one entity to the other, but now it becomes more accountable, more responsible, where you have to report all your financials to the markets, and there are several analysts sitting there who are studying you, and in that sense, there is some understanding of how this company is doing. Before disinvestment or any of this, all this was a black box. There was no understanding, but now we understand much more about the Indian economy, and these things because of the disinvestment bit.
And finally, thank you so much for giving the wonderful insights to us on disinvestments. I'm very sure that our viewers are going to have a great takeaways from this session. Thanks a lot for giving the time to us.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for the opportunity. Thank you so much.